Welcome back to the channel, guys. Only ETFs, where we go over everything ETF related. I am your host, Eugen Vasquez, and I am here joined with my co-host, Skeptic in the house. All right. And today we have an episode, a banger of an episode for you guys. All right. But let's give us a round of applause because this is our 6th episode.
Yes, indeed.
So, Skeptic, man, what's up? Welcome back. What do you got going on?
Well, what I've got going on is very excited to discuss something that we talked about in one of our earliest videos, especially since now we've been in contact with the fund managers, so we know a little bit more about them now. At first we mistook them for VanEck, but they're not VanEck.
That is true. That is very true. So let's get our drum roll here and let's talk about this ETF. So this is the ETF we're going to be talking about. From PurePlay ETFs. All right. That is the fund manager. PurePlay ETFs. We mistakenly said that they were with VanEck, which was not entirely true. They are their own fund manager. So we are excited to talk about these guys, all right, because they are the new kids on the block as far as I know. But they just released about a month ago the NVIDIA ecosystem picks and shovels index ETF, all right, ticker NVPS. And what makes this ETF very, very niche, very special is that every company selected for this ETF has some business dealing with NVIDIA. So that's what makes this ETF very specific. It's not like the broader based SMH type of ETFs or the more very super niche ETFs like DRAM, where there's only like a couple of holdings in there. This one has all the companies that actually deal with NVIDIA or supply to NVIDIA. So this one's really, really special. So anyways, let's get into it, guys. We're going to cover this at a very high level, and then we're going to go in depth talking about the actual ETF. All right. So just again, at a high level, it only has 39 holdings. All right. So there's only 39 holdings in this ETF, and it has a expense ratio of 75 basis points. This one is a pure growth ETF. This is not an income ETF. There is no income strategies on this. All right. So again, this is a fairly new ETF. All right. We're going to go over these holdings later on in the video, but let's talk about the key highlights. All right. And what this fund actually invests in. All right, so they're actually investing in companies upstream of NVIDIA and downstream of NVIDIA, but you're not getting exposure to NVIDIA. I think that is a very important piece in all of this. So you're not getting exposure to NVIDIA directly. All right, so these are all the companies that are labeled as picks and shovel companies. All right, so what it is and what it is not. Well, what NVPS, and I kind of already told you guys, is that it's going to give you exposure to the upstream and the downstream companies that help build and manufacture or have a dealing with NVIDIA, but it does not invest in shares of NVIDIA. Okay. Why this strategy exists? This is actually a very, kind of, and I keep saying this, but a very niche, a very special ETF, because there's no other ETF like this where they're dealing with the upstream and the downstream, all right, or companies that actually have direct dealings with the largest semiconductor company, the most valuable semiconductor company in the world, and that is NVIDIA. All right, so we're going to actually talk about how companies enter this ETF. All right, it's very, very straightforward. I promise you guys, there is no fancy market cap weightings. There's no, any of that. This is actually a proprietary. This is a proprietary method that the ETF fund manager uses, and we're going to cover all of that.
Real quick, basically, to summarize, this would be considered a supply chain ETF. So one of the first ones, actually, like a lot of there's a few of them out now. We'll discuss those later, but this was one of the first ones that is a dedicated supply chain, and I predict that we'll see more of these. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if soon we'll see ones for Google or ones for Apple, but this is specifically for NVIDIA.
And that's very true. I mean, there's a lot of these specialty and thematic ETFs that are coming out. I mean, they're coming out at a time when AI and everything under AI is all of the rage. I mean, whether it's semiconductors, whether it's foundries, whether it's the raw materials or the optics, whatever is involved with data centers, AI, and chips. There seems to be a lot of ETFs coming out, and they're all kind of different in very different ways. It's, none of these ETFs are exactly copies of each other. Like, they're not, following a market cap weighting for the semiconductor sector or maybe a subsector. They're all kind of very different in their strategy and their company selection. So anyways, getting back to this, as I mentioned before, again, you're going to have suppliers, which are entities from which the source company purchases goods or services, and partners with NVIDIA. All right, a formal or disclosed strategic alliance, such as an R&D collaboration or joint venture. All this data is coming from FactSet. All right, supply chain data. So there is an actual website that covers all of this. Okay, and here's just some eligibility screens that this ETF employs in order to select the companies. You need an average daily trading volume of at least $3 million over the prior 3 months, free float market cap of at least 1 billion. So you're going to have, again, some small caps in here as well. And the bottom line is NVPS is built to capture the broad ecosystem around NVIDIA rather than owning NVIDIA directly. All right, it's going to focus on suppliers and partners. You're not going to have exposure to NVIDIA itself. All right, so
Right.
Let's talk about the business relevant analysis. Skeptic, what can you tell us about this? How they actually select these companies?
Okay, so straight from the top, rather than chasing like general tech indices or over concentrating on a single stock, NVPS really focuses on, like we said before, the picks and shovels of the AI ecosystem. So that basically means that its relevance lies in capturing the revenues across the physical supply chain of the chips required to run an advanced systems. So we're talking like power and thermal management. That basically means infrastructure for the high performance data centers, manufacturing and fabrication, which is like companies involved in semiconductor production, as we all know, and chip packaging, and memory and connectivity, which is a big component. It's essentially like the hardware component that supports the processing. And so the inclusion process, so they really use this, they use a private system. They won't go into full disclosure with it, but they labeled it as a systematic data-driven method used to calculate the relationship of the data in their supply chain. So it's pretty custom. They keep it on the low, but that's the title that they have for it. So that includes like revenue screening. Of course, you need to have that. So you won't even be a candidate if you don't derive at least like half your revenue from supply chain activities that are directly related to NVIDIA operations. So that's step one. Step two is how it gets categorized. So once you get past step one, you'll become a qualified business, and they get mapped into 6 pillars, which are raw materials, tools, fabrication, packaging, infrastructure, and connectivity. And we'll go more in depth over those pillars. And along with those pillars are 3 tiers, which is supporting, core, or critical.
Yep. And just to cut in here real quick, just for the audience, just want you guys to know that these right here are the sectors and subsectors of this ETF and what's actually in there. All right. So you're going to have semiconductor raw materials. Who would have thunk it, right? You're going to have semiconductor manufacturing equipment and tools. You're going to have the fabrication, the packaging, the infrastructure, which we're going to cover here in a moment, because there's actually some names that I would have never guessed would have been in an ETF like this. All right. You're also going to have connectivity, chemical, gases, critical minerals, AI server manufacturing, and systems engineering, all packaged into this ETF. Again, this is everything that has to do with NVIDIA, right? Producing an NVIDIA chip, installing an NVIDIA chip, making sure that the NVIDIA chip has passed quality checks, the metrology and all that stuff, which we will be covering here very shortly. One other point that I want to point out is that this will be ongoing. Okay, so PurePlay will be, looking at their candidates on an ongoing, basis, right, and reviewing and monitoring them. All right, so that is what's nice. So if any company decides to cut ties with NVIDIA, they will probably be kicked out of this ETF. So I just thought that was a very important piece in all of this.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, moving on. You guys heard Skeptic already cover it, but there's actually 3 tiers that PurePlay uses in order to classify each of the companies. All right. And I thought this was actually really interesting. So they're actually sharing with us how they select the companies and how they classify them. Okay. And we talked about those pillars, which we will cover here in just a moment, what those actual pillars are within the ETF. All right. But anyways, getting back to the tiers. So you have tier 3, which is the most critical. That means NVIDIA cannot meaningfully operate without the company, or the company is a single source supplier to NVIDIA. So that's a key word there, a single source supplier. Then you also have tier 2, which is a core, all right, and that provides essential components, equipment, software, or infrastructure to NVIDIA's ecosystem, but is not non-exclusive. All right, it's a non-exclusive basis, so it is still really important, right? And then you have supporting importance. All right, that's tier 1, and they provide, these are companies that provide relevant ecosystem contributions, but is not essential for NVIDIA manufacturing. So this could be a data center, right? You could be thinking of like a data center in this, type of supporting role, right? Which we will cover here in just a bit. All right, moving down. These are the fixed pillars, which we will cover here in just a moment, but this is actually what makes up the ETF. All right. So you have tools, you have fabrication, infrastructure, connectivity, packaging, and raw materials. Now, here's the interesting thing. This ETF actually reconstitutes, which means basically rebalance, twice a year. They do it semi-annually, right? So let's say for some unknown reason that infrastructure has a crazy year and it just climbs up some insane amount. Well, when they reconstitute or they rebalance, they will bring it back to 20%, right? So fabrication, tools, and infrastructure make up close to 70% of this ETF. Okay, 70%. Then you have connectivity, which is the fiber and everything else, the optics, the photonics. Then you have the packaging and the raw materials coming in at 16%, 10%, and 4% respectively. All right. One interesting thing that I actually like about this ETF is that each of these pillars, because all of these companies that we're going to go over here in a minute, in a few minutes, all of these companies are fit into each of these different pillars. All right. So each of these different pillars has a list of companies that are associated with it. They will not go over 8%. All right. So no single company will be reconstituted or rebalanced over 8%. So, you're kind of spreading the risk around, and no single company is going to, just have this insane weighting to it, because we already see what's happening with the Kospi, which is the South Korean index. We see that they have a 66% weighting basically to two companies, SK Hynix and Samsung. And we already see what's happening with those two companies and what's happening to the entire index. Basically, it's going down as of the making of this video, down 20%. That's a pretty big deal. So anyways, that is very important. I think that's a very important piece in this. And again, they reconstitute or rebalance this ETF on a semi-annual basis. And each of these different pillars, right, they all have every individual security goes through this weighting rule. So I think that's also pretty cool. Speaking about those pillars, what can you tell us about those pillars?
My favorite part. So we might as well start with the hardest components, the raw materials. So in the raw materials pillar, these are the companies that provide the fundamental chemical and physical inputs required to make all the silicone chips. So wafers, gases, rare earths, special chemicals. So these are all the companies that supply the industrial gases like neon and helium. And guess what those two things are used for? Lithography, remember that? So silicone wafers and photoresist. So photoresist is a special material that is used to make, I don't want to say sunproof, but I'll say light resistant, light/heat resistant, like UV ray resistant. And other specialty chemicals used for etching and cleaning out the circuits. So we have to make sure everything can survive in the heat, make sure all the materials can survive in the daylight. And the second pillar would be the tools, one of the biggest pillars, if not the biggest pillar. This covers the manufacturers of the precise high-tech machinery used inside the semiconductor factories, the ones we're all pretty familiar with. So like these companies make all the lithography systems. So, and that basically means the machines that print the patterns onto the chips, because every chip has a pattern or else it wouldn't work. And metrology, remember that one? The study of inspection and measurement. Got to make sure everything's weighted and measured correctly. And the third pillar would be the fabrication. So these are kind of like the foundries that physically manufacture the chips based on NVIDIA's design. So this is where things get more custom to NVIDIA. So these kind of companies are like the dedicated semiconductor foundries that operate and manage like pretty much their private manufacturing processes. We've discussed those before. And the fourth pillar would be packaging. So after a chip is made, it has to be protected and it has to be connected to a circuit board. That's where these companies come in handy. So this is critical for AI chips, which use advanced 2D, 2.5D, or 3D packaging. And like these kind of companies specialize in outsourced assembly and testing. So normally you wouldn't be able to get these companies. You have to find them separately because they're outsourced. But ETFs like NVPS, throw them in there for you. They would probably be under small caps, and they test the chips on the wafer bonding and advanced like interconnecting technologies, making sure that they all play ball together, basically. Then the fifth pillar, which is the infrastructure, another huge pillar. So this pillar captures the physical hardware needed to install and run these chips in all data centers. So they make all the liquid cooling systems, which, you know, you can't have AI racks without them, and the power supply units, all the server racks, and like the HBM, the high performance bandwidth memory providers. So we've definitely heard that term before because we talked about it before. So like top holdings might be like SK Hynix and Micron. You know, they're the OGs in the space. Everyone knows about them. You know, and HBM is essential for NVIDIA GPUs. And then the sixth pillar, which is connectivity. Everything has to connect, everything has to work all in tandem. So these AI clusters require thousands of chips to talk to each other instantly, which is a massive amount of bandwidth. We have to make sure that they are all able to communicate and respond. So these companies pretty much make sure that happens. So these companies make all the optical transceivers, the high-speed Ethernet switches, and the photonics that link everything together and make sure everything turns on. This pillars 1 through 5 bring everything together. Pillar 6 is like a light switch. You turn it on and they all have to work.
Yep, and that is awesome. I'm actually really happy that you know, they included this in the perspectives, because now we actually know how they're constructing this and what, you know, companies are selecting and what, you know, kind of sector that they fall under, or what pillar that they actually fall under. So I think this is really unique to this ETF. And, you know, again, just shout out to PurePlay ETFs for putting that in the prospectus and having kind of a formula that we can follow. So anyways,
Right.
Moving on. All right, we want to talk about country exposure. So NVPS actually holds a ton of different companies, all right, 39 to be exact. And all these companies are all over the world. It's not just companies in the United States. But what you will notice is that there's no companies from China, obviously for geopolitical stuff and, you know, things of that nature.
Right.
But I think it's very important we at least cover this. If we look at all of the holdings, and actually where they're coming from, we see that 50% is coming from the United States. Right? You have some very big names like Micron, Vertiv, Applied Materials in here, and that makes up 50% of this ETF. And then you have South Korea coming in, of course, with SK Hynix and Samsung Electronics. And then you have Taiwan, which, you know, obviously, if you guys know Taiwan Semiconductor, I think this is a no-brainer. You would include this in this ETF. But anyways, you have 14% to Taiwan. You also have ASE Technology and Micron, which I have never heard of. But anyways, you also have Japan. You have Netherlands. Of course, you have Netherlands. You have ASML, right? ASML is the big dog in the space. And then you have France, Ireland, United Kingdom, and actually Thailand coming in at smaller allocations. So I just think it's really important we understand the countries that the holdings are from and that make up this ETF, because, you know, the last thing you want to have is some type of geopolitical event occur and the ETF get absolutely smashed. But we all know that these are all countries that are obviously, you know, I want to say friendly towards the United States. The United States is friendly towards them. So again, just a big deal. When we're talking about being investors, we want to account for all types of risks. All right.
It's pretty diversified for a thematic ETF. And I am under the impression that that's going to be a core function of these supply chain ETFs. Like they're going to be thematic, and traditionally speaking, thematic ETFs are not diversified by default, but because of how these are allocated and the geography of them, there is a level of internal diversification that these are going to have. So keep that in mind.
But here's another interesting point, Skeptic, is that these are all the countries that are involved in the supply chain for producing a single NVIDIA chip.
Right.
Right. I think that is also a very kind of a nuanced point, kind of a very small point that probably investors would have overlooked. But anyways, I just wanted to cover that in this portion. Now let's talk about the big one. Everyone is looking forward to this, I am sure. All right. These are the actual holdings that make up this ETF, and there are 39 of them. Okay. So I'm not going to go over every single one because this video would go on for probably 2 to 3 hours. But what we will do is cover them at a very high level and just kind of explain what the sector or the subsector is and what it does. All right. So let's get into it, ladies and gentlemen. All right. Let's get that applause going.
Yes.
All right. First up, we have the memory and semiconductors, and you guys know these names. They're no strangers to you guys. These are the SK Hynixes, the Microns, and the Samsungs. All right. And again, you guys can see they're weighting. It is a little bit high for Micron and SK Hynix, but that's because Micron and SK Hynix has grown so much in value, right? But obviously now it's coming down a bit. There's a correction going on. So we will see these values change over time. And obviously when they do the reconstitution or the rebalance, these will all be reset. All right.
Right.
But memory semiconductors, they produce HBM, DRAM, and NAND memory. HBM sits close to the GPUs and AI accelerators, and that's why these are so important. SK Hynix, Micron, Samsung are the top producers. As a matter of fact, they own the market share for DRAM. All right. So that's why they're so important. We also have wafer fabrication. All right. We have Applied Materials, Lam Research, ASML, Tokyo Electron, and ASM. All right. They make highly specialized machines used to deposit, etch, clean, pattern microscopic layers onto semiconductor wafers. All right, ASML's lithography, they own that entire market. All right, ASML owns the entire lithography market, basically. But yeah. Lithography systems print the circuit patterns used to manufacture chips. We also have data center power, cooling, and electrical infrastructure, which I thought was really cool that they added this into the ETF, because these are some of the names that you'd never hear about. That's names like Schneider Electric, Eaton, Lite-On, Oris Technology, and Vertiv. Now, I've only personally heard of Schneider Electric, Eaton, and Lite-On. They make a lot of the UPSs, the batteries, the battery technology to power some of these data centers and to hold the power whenever they call it prime power goes out. So like when the grid actually goes down, the backup power, the generators, the Eaton, the Lite-On, the Schneider Electric, that's what these are. But anyways, data center power, cooling, electric, what this is, they supply UPS systems, which means uninterruptible power supply systems. All right. Also switchgear, power distribution panels, electrical controls, air cooling, liquid cooling, and thermal management equipment. We also have AI servers and contract manufacturers. You guys know these names. All right. That's Dell, that's Supermicro, that's HP, Hewlett Packard, right? You have Foxconn in there, which makes a lot of hardware. I've never heard of Wistron, I'm not going to lie, but I have heard of these other names. All right, they design, assemble, manufacture GPU server racks, storage, and complete AI systems for cloud companies. They're actually designing the entire servers, right? And they hold all those NVIDIA chips. Okay, that's coming in at 9.13%. We have the semiconductor design and processor IP. That's Marvell, that's Broadcom, that's ARM. These companies design custom AI silicon networking chips, interconnect products. Like Marvell is getting a huge bid because of their, involvement in photonics right now. And then you have Broadcom designing a lot of the chips for Google and for all these other custom chips for like Meta and everybody else, the ASIC chips. And you have ARM. ARM's been catching a huge bid. They're a company based out of the United Kingdom, and ARM has been heavily involved in the mobile phone industry, right? The portable industry, right? And now they're developing their own AI chips. So we also have semiconductor inspection, metrology, and testing. These are the companies that, develop tools to QC, to quality check, to audit these chips as they're manufactured. So you're going to have KLA, you're going to have Advantest. We've covered these companies before. You're going to have Laser Tech, Form Factor, and Onto Innovation. We also have the semiconductor foundry manufacturing. And of course, there's only one company that produces NVIDIA chips, and that is
Taiwan Semi.
That's the big one. That's the big one. That's Taiwan Semi. All right. That's the big guy. All right. So we all know who Taiwan Semi is, based out of Taiwan, and they pretty much produce up to 80% of the market semiconductors, right? They produce pretty much the world's semiconductors.
Yeah.
So obviously they would be in this ETF, right? But we also have advanced packaging, assembly, and substrates. You're going to have Micron, Amcor Tech, Eaton, and ASE. I've never heard of these companies. I'm not going to even front here. I'm not going to even cap.
So this would be a prime example of, I won't say small, but I'll say the non-large caps that people don't know that are making moves in the world because they're in the background. ETFs like NVPS bring them to the front. Now we learn about them.
That is an excellent point. Yeah, that's a really good point, because again, there's so many companies out there that are involved in the manufacturing and supply of these NVIDIA chips, but you've never heard of them. And they're very important, right? Obviously, they have to have some importance if they're included in this ETF. But moving on, we also have semiconductor materials. You're going to have Tokyo in here, ticker TOK. Sumco, never heard of these companies. But again, these are overseas companies, if I'm not mistaken. They supply essential chip making material. All right, so Tokyo Oka makes photoresist and high chemicals used to print circuits, while Sumco supplies silicon wafers on which the chips are manufactured. Again, these are very, very important companies, very niche companies you probably have never heard of. This is something special here, but we have data centers in here. We have actual data center REITs, which are real estate investment trusts. All right?
Awesome.
These are included in the ETF. You have the big names, Equinix and Digital Realty. These are data centers or data center companies that own the real estate, right? They own several of these data centers throughout the United States and some overseas as well. But these data centers, what they do is they own and operate facilities that provide physical space, power, cooling, security, and network connectivity for servers and AI hardware. I can go on a whole thing about Equinix and Digital Realty because I've actually used to own both of these tickers. EQIX and DLR are the tickers if you're interested, but we'll cover these maybe in another video. We also have data center networking and optical manufacturing. We have Arista Networks. You guys know Arista, I'm sure you've probably heard it before, and Fabrinet, which is coming in at a very small percentage. Fabrinet is actually based out of Thailand, which I was very surprised to find out. But these are companies that supply high-speed Ethernet switches and optical components that move huge volumes of data between the GPUs, server storage systems, and data centers. And how can we not have an ETF that is involved with NVIDIA without having two companies that create the software for engineers to design these chips? And that is Synopsys and Cadence, right? The electronic design automation software. They provide software to the engineers to design, simulate, verify, and prepare complex semiconductor chips for manufacturing. Very important companies. There's only two of them. They own basically the entire market. So that is all of the companies that make up this ETF. Skeptic, do you have anything to add?
Like I said before, one of my favorite things about these kind of ETFs, specifically NVPS, is they bring small caps to the front, and small caps isn't talked about enough, but in my opinion, we've been in the year of the small caps where a lot of them have been coming to the forefront and coming into discovery. And mind you, these are companies that have been working in the background for a minute. Like, they didn't just come out last year or 2 years ago. They've been around. It's just that people didn't know about them yet. But you know, they've mostly been catching a bid this year, and I don't think that they're done, which I think is one of the biggest pros of NVPS, the integral small cap exposure, which sounds like an oxymoron, but yes, the integral small cap exposure that this covers.
Yep, I have to agree 100%. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is what makes up this particular ETF. All right. Again, this ETF is coming from PurePlay ETFs, the new kid on the block. All right. NVPS is the ticker. If you guys are interested in this ETF, be sure to check it out. All right. Let us know down in the comments what you guys think. All right. So anyways, this has been an episode from Only ETFs. Skeptic, do you have any final words before we go on and get out?
Personal, unprofessional investing opinion. Heavily consider, especially if you're interested in AI and chips and tech in general, heavily consider ETFs like NVPS and where they fit into your portfolio. And And one of the coolest things about them is that they don't own anything in the Mag 10, anything in the Mag 7. There's no NVIDIA, because it's crazy to think that all these companies help create what NVIDIA is. So think of it that way and figure out where it can fit in your portfolio.
Absolutely. Awesome. As always, none of this is financial advice. Please do your own research, talk to your own professionals or finance professionals, financial advisors, etc. And with that being said, we will see you guys in the next episode. You guys take care.
See you later.